Welcome to the Homelab show number 131, Home Desktop OS, Linux, Windows, Apple. Should I put Mac or Apple? I couldn't decide, but I can always retitle it if someone thinks I'm completely wrong. I mean, do we refer to it as Apple OS or refer to it as Mac OS? I don't know. Anyways, I'm sure someone will be pedantic about that. I am flying solo today. Jay is heads down working on another course. So check out his previous course over at LearnLinux TV. He's got a full Linux course. He's working on a new course as well, which I think he said he'll have done within the next few days. But that's why he is not available to record today. But I thought I wanted to make this topic about the Linux desktop. It's not something we directly covered. Me and Jay lean Linux heavy, but I want to give Windows its fair shake. And it's it's kind of a challenge because Windows is getting worse all the time. And I've been a Linux user for so long, I don't know, I'm going to call myself a little bit Windows dumb. And this is kind of where we're going to start with this. I am not as good here in 2024 with Windows as I used to be. I'm actually probably more familiar with some of the Windows Server OS things, but like actually sitting down and using stuff. I mean, I know how to start services and things like that, but that's really kind of where I stop. I'm just not someone is fluent in Windows, and it's because of my lack of use of Windows. That doesn't mean on the IT business side, I don't spend time supporting Windows, and less me, more my company, more and more of the staff. So there's kind of a mix of interactions I have. But that's kind of what makes the Home Lab so interesting, is because it comes down to what you want. But let's kind of weigh the pros and cons of some of the choices here. And answer the first question that seems to come up all the time is, Tom, what desktop OS are you using? And this is a little bit of a challenge that I'll gripe a little bit at the Linux people with. The community, and Jeff from Craft Computing, by the way, did a great video about the switching to Linux challenge. Is kind of what had me really thinking about this. I was talking to Jeff. He's really a great creator. And he talked about some of the real challenges as a creator trying to use Linux, and the community of, just use this insert name of open source project that people think is somewhat equivalent, but really isn't equivalent. And that is a big challenge for sure. But let's go with my Linux desktop and the software I use, which is Pop! OS. And, I started using Linux on the desktop with Ubuntu all the way back 15 years ago. I'm looking at my notes over here going, yeah, wow. I noted that it was 2008 when I switched. And back then I actually was running Windows 7. And I kind of cheated. So it's not like I really switched, because I've always used tools like VirtualBox to be able to run a virtual version of Windows. Especially, I was very Adobe dependent back then. It takes a long time to get off the Adobe software. Then I switched to KDE Neon, and that was around 2017 probably. And I did a couple videos on KDE Neon because I thought it was really cool. And eventually I just didn't like some of the quirkiness with it, and then moved right over to Pop! OS in 2019. And that's what I've been on ever since. Pop! OS is essentially based off Ubuntu. I think it works really, really well. The Pop Shop is nice. The Flatpak installs are smooth. It opens up a lot of the application usage that I have via Flatpak, which is easy because you can just, Flatpak install and manage those. And I don't know, maybe I could do a video on that. It's a, kind of one of those things about, how hard should it be to install things? And I think Flatpak, it has some pros and cons with the way it stores things. So but kind of a mix when you're setting this up. I don't know the exact answer. I did see someone ask, didn't you make an episode about having a backup OS? Yeah, there is, reasons to kind of think about other OSs. I'm not too worried about something happening to Pop! OS. And yeah, it was a talk that Jay kind of brought up. I thought he had some interesting perspectives on it. But yeah, it's hard to say if really, I don't really have a backup OS. I kind of do because I use a Mac, and we'll talk about Mac in a moment. But I use a MacBook Air mostly as like a Chromebook is almost how I describe it, other than, I'm using the terminal a bit in it, but I SSH over to my jump box. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. These are the tools I'm using. I'm going to run down a list here, and I can throw them into the show description. I'll make sure I update the notes for this. These are the apps I use on here. And these are all going to be apps that natively run fine in Linux. And the Slack for Business is going to be on the list. It's probably not something that everyone's going to use, but if you're using this as your business desktop, and I do communicate with all my staff and people via Slack. Matter of fact, I belong to a lot of Slack groups that are what I refer to as business adjacent, that are companies I work with. I'm in their Slack. So having Slack native on Linux works great. Signal Messenger, that is my go-to for all my security friends. Obviously, I use Chrome a lot because that's what my business is using in terms of Google. So using Chrome and using Google for lawrencesystems.com kind of goes hand in hand for a smooth operation. But I do use Firefox for personal. But because I use it for personal, you don't see me as much using it in videos because Lawrence Systems is the entity that controls the YouTube channel. And so that's where that data gets produced. I use LibreOffice quite a bit. I maybe someone's going to say this that makes me old because I'm still using local applications, but I'm not an nextcloud user, and I don't think everything needs to be in the cloud. I'm fine with using desktop OS. And once again, LibreOffice is nice, very cross-platform, opens Microsoft Office documents reasonably well. SyncThing, because, well, if documents live on your system, I'd like them backed up in real time. SyncThing has been my go-to for that. I love SyncThing. Deja Dupe. That has been a long time tool I've used for backups. Works really well in Linux. That way I have, snapshots of a certain time when that backup runs. Actually runs every few days because SyncThing backs up anything in real time. Deja Dupe is what covers, the snapshots, if you will, of things, including all my config files are backed up that way. And I thought about doing a video about how I backed up Linux. I'll throw some comments in there if you want to see me do a video about how I back up Linux. Maybe it'll help with some ideas. LogSeek is my favorite cross-platform journaling tool, if you will. That is how I manage my second brain of knowledge. That's where the notes are that I'm reading this from as we talk. So LogSeek works really well. Once again, SyncThing keeps LogSync in sync across my platforms. I think it's called Remina, Remmina. It's a tool that supports RDP, so I can RDP into Windows sessions. I still use KMyMoney. I did a video about this a long time ago, and it's a pretty cool product for managing ledgers and importing bank accounts too. It's kind of a one-off, but I know some people probably do their personal banking on there, and you could use it for that as well. Draw.io, that's another app on there. Now, do I use GIMP? Pretty much only for the thumbnails for the Homelab show. I just insist on using GIMP for it. Everything else, I've been using different web applications, mostly Canva, to create YouTube thumbnails. And I've really weaned myself off of using any Adobe products. And then DaVinci Resolve and Jeff from Craft Computing really did a good job of telling you the problems and the good and bad, so to speak, of some of the issues you may run into running DaVinci Resolve on Linux. I didn't run into the same problems he had, but he is right about the codec problem. He had a windowing issue with it that is something I think had more to do with the Zorin OS he used. I used Pop OS, so I think that's not too big of a deal. And then we have Barrier, which is a really cool tool to control everything that is on multiple computers. You can use one keyboard and mouse, and then you can use another computer with the same keyboard and mouse. So my Linux system acts as a Barrier server, and other computers can be Barrier clients. It's a really neat application. Maybe at some point I can do some videos on it as a topic, but Veronica Explain has a really good YouTube channel with a talk on Barrier that covers it really well. Now, let's go back over to, though, choosing what you want to use for your desktop OS. And there's a lot of good reasons to ditch Windows. There's definitely the creepy spying factor that Microsoft is just making it harder and harder to even have a local account. I did see a notice where Microsoft just kind of, and we already know they're always turning on their services, but whether or not they're uploading data to those accounts in a more automated way. And I can't figure out if, I don't know that Microsoft's necessarily nefarious. I think they just want not necessarily your data as much, maybe to an extent, but mostly you living and dependent on their ecosystem. This is why when you say files, it's constantly pushing you that way of, they really want this, get you wrapped up with an account tied to your Azure, tied to your systems, and everything they can do to get you hopefully paying recurring fees for their services. And by the way, I actually give money to Pop OS. So I know Linux is technically free. You can download and run it, but I actually like to support the projects. Zorin's another one I know that has that. I mentioned it because Jeff from Craft Computing mentioned it. And it's one of those things where the whole problem of, everything should be free, it still needs someone to develop it. I just want to try not to go too off on a tangent on that, but you can get any of the Linux OS is free. Obviously, Microsoft, for the most part, I'm not going to say Windows is free because it's not, but you so many, even these mini PCs I've covered come with a Windows license built in. So you don't really have necessarily that expense outside of, I guess, if you're building your own desktop by hand, you're going to have to buy a Windows license. So the price is less about that, but the customization and the privacy of Linux makes it very attractive. Now, the customization is also a double-edged sword. It makes it really hard if you're in the Windows ecosystem to switch. You go and I have all these choices, and some people go, oh no, I have too many choices. Which one do I do? And this is why the argument of the whole, like, which are we going to use, which desktop environment is the best, and lots of opinions are going to start flying. Which distro do you use? Even more strong opinions, and it can be very daunting to decide whether or not you want to switch. So whether or not you get caught up in that mess or not is kind of it's a challenge when you're starting out new. That's one of the reasons I tell people I don't have a long list of why I'll justify Pop OS and some essay I will write and try to convince you it is the, let us say, religion of choice, because that's how some people seem to treat their desktop OS. I'll just say it works well, even for beginners. It's got good documentation, good shortcuts, and a pop shop is, I think, relatively easy to use. But use what makes you happy. I say that quite a bit. But those choices can make it really hard to switch to Linux. Now, performance and efficiency. Uh, Windows is definitely doing something all the time that makes it a little bit less efficient, but I really dislike, and I'm seeing less of these articles, but hey, refresh your old PC with Linux and make it fast again. That's not necessarily true, because so many of the problems you run into are very complex web pages require a reasonable amount of compute power in order to render properly. And no amount of OS changing necessarily fixes that. You can relieve some of the pressure. Microsoft might be doing a bunch of background things. Updates take a long time on Windows. Those are all true things. But switching to Linux just solves that problem. It didn't make the browser render a page faster. A lot of that is CPU bound, and therefore it can be a little bit challenging. Overall, though, I find Linux to be quite performant and snappy because unless you crap it up with things, or unless you do something that wasn't out of the box for most distributions, or specifically like Ubuntu based ones, Linux, I would say, overall does have a little bit of an edge on how fast it is. Windows does boot way faster now that they moved to some of the more modern ways they do things, but boot time isn't usually what people are concerned with. The community, though, for Linux, that's where I think it's that back to the double-edged sword, like I said before. Definitely, if you ask the OS question or what's a substitute for Adobe, you're definitely going to have a lot of strong opinions. But if you run into a problem in Linux, like, hey, I'm trying to get this done, I think the community support is actually really solid on that. There's a lot of people that offer a lot of help that are very general, because you're asking the specific question. You're not asking the religious debate, if you will, of which OS should I choose or which desktop environment. You're like, hey, I'm having trouble getting this particular device to work. Now, out of the box, Linux, in the recent video I just did with a B-Link, for example, the little B-Link mini PC, Linux had, I think, 100% of the drivers out of the box worked fine, no problem. Windows 11 loaded on it did not. B-Link had drivers I could download, so I downloaded those drivers and got everything set up. It wasn't, difficult to do, but it's pretty amazing today how well supported devices are. Kind of going back to even Jeff from Craft Computing, these are not devices that you would necessarily have unless you're in the creative space, but even the capture cards now are supported in Linux. They're supported quite well. But even though they're supported, one of the reasons I use Windows as my media ingestion computer, I have a Windows desktop with those same capture cards, and it works better with some things. The Stream Deck is an example. Once again, it's kind of application support where, yes, the cards work, but controlling the cards and controlling the inputs and playing with some of the codec issues, it's just easier in Windows. So that's one of the reasons I still run a Windows computer for ingesting all the media files. It just support works that much better for it. But as far as like your standard network interfaces and everything else, Linux is really doing a great job on that. That is something like sound, no problem. Your Wi-Fi adapters pretty much work now. That was always a huge problem in the early days of Linux desktops, was having to build sometimes your drivers. That was a common thing when I first started. Now it's kind of no big deal at all. You can just go run it, and out of the box, it detects everything, including those newer 2.5 gig network adapters and things like that. And yeah, Linux is way better at that than I think even Windows is. And I'll even say for, going down to the software compatibility, most of the business applications I mentioned at the beginning, like Slack, and of course, probably a lot of people like Discourse. You can get a Discourse native app through the Pop Shop. I believe it installs via Flatpak. They probably have a dev file as well. The reasons a lot of these apps work is because they're not really natively written applications. They're just web wrappers, kind of bundled into an application. They use, I'm trying to remember the backend they use for that, for when they build these applications. It's a pretty popular framework that they can be built on. So they're pulling, it's kind of like rendering a browser inside of what is an application. And that's what's allowed a lot of this cross compatibility. And I think that's really good. So it makes Linux way easier to switch to, because, I can't really, I wouldn't hate to have to run a VirtualBox instance just to run Slack. And Slack on the desktop as a application is way better than Slack in a browser. Now you can run Slack in a browser. It's just not as nice. I do like it kind of as a standalone. It just, I don't know, seems to work better. I don't run Discourse on an application. I do run that inside of the browser, because I don't like the way it can see some things in the clipboard, or I think it has some permissions which you can restrict down of what it can see, but I don't like that it'll tell you like, hey, they're listening to Spotify. And thank you, someone in the chat said Electron is the thing I was looking for on there. Now, gaming support, I am thrilled at, like, the Steam Deck and things like that. We've really brought things way ahead in the gaming world, and many of the large games, the A title games, are working and supported with that. But that being said, it's not really about whether or not some popular games are working. It's about, are the games you want to play working? And especially because some games have some anti-cheat technology, that's going to push you back into the Windows world quite a bit. And matter of fact, this will push you back into the Windows world, which I think is perfectly fine. For that, I have a separate Windows gaming computer because I don't think gaming should be crossed into my business world. I try to keep these very, very separate. It's kind of a security boundary. I'm very particular about what does get loaded on my Linux desktop, because I try to keep it really narrowed and locked down to certain applications. So I do think gaming should probably be something separate if you have security boundaries that you're worried about. But the kind of the last part of it is the Windows support for the odd devices. Now, this kind of comes up when you have certain extra devices that maybe need some level of application control. And I'm going to point at the Steam Deck, because it's sitting on my desk, as one of those easy examples of why I stay on Windows. Now, I'll extend this a little bit into the business side of things as well. What about, recommending, and this comes up quite a bit because I'm such a Linux nerd, if you will, that people say, well, Tom, aren't you recommending the Linux desktop for your clients? And in the business world, that becomes a lot harder, and probably a good reason that you should, if you're supporting or working in the industry, keep a Windows desktop around so you have a good understanding of it, especially if you have to interact with your clients using it. And it's not as easy to get the business world to switch, because line of business applications love or hate QuickBooks, mostly on the hate side for myself. QuickBooks is a really popular application. I know at one point they're going to move that into the cloud. In some areas they have, but that's just in small example. A bigger example is going to be all the other line of business applications that are tied to very deeply, not just running Windows, but also an extension of needing Active Directory. Yes, you can join Ubuntu to Active Directory. There is an option for that. I think Jay may have a video on it, but it's really not the same when it comes to the level of management and control and the tooling we use in the business world that kind of keeps a lot of people on Windows. And Windows is, for better or worse, it's still an environment that a lot of people are familiar with. And if you don't really want to go through the pain of change, I don't think there's anything wrong. As a matter of fact, if you find any old versions of Tom telling people that they should, be running Linux, that version of Tom is wrong from maybe years ago. I won't say I've never said it. There is a chance I have, and I will admit fully here in 2024, it's not necessarily the right thing to do. I was debating about doing a video of like, should you switch to Linux? And I said, I'll just do it as a Homelab show episode here, because, this has been rattling around in my head. Now, I mentioned Mac OS a bit here, and I will dive into that as a topic, because I also do have a MacBook Air. And I hate how much I love it would be the way I would describe my feelings. Like Mac OS is slightly Linux like, but it is a walled garden of the way Apple wants things to be. And that walled garden is nice for seamless integration. That much I can admit. So if you have several Apple devices and you want synchronization between them, yeah, they've done a nice job of creating that ecosystem. But it is a walled garden, and that can be kind of challenging because they really want you to live and stay in their ecosystem. I defy that, if you will. I like that my MacBook Air has an absolutely insane battery life. I've seen someone mention ARM is coming. And Mac's kind of leading the way, showing, hey, we can build this on ARM and we can build something really efficiently like this. And this is where, if you didn't know, I believe it's called Tuxedo Computers, is working on some next generation ARM stuff. So I think Linux is going to catch up with it. Microsoft has some new ARM systems coming out, and my comment right away is cool. I hope they are. I hope there's going to be good Linux support for them, because I'd love a Linux really fast ARM system, because there is no doubt my MacBook Air compared to, I mean, I know I can load stuff on a Raspberry Pi. That's not really the best experience. I mean, Raspberry Pis are reasonably fast, and it's a good example of ARM. And I've seen some of the ARM laptops that have been made. None of them have impressed me in terms of this. Like Chromebooks are technically ARM on that. But I really think the mass adoption of ARM, when it gets over to the Linux world, is going to be huge. In the meantime, I can't tell you a better laptop to buy than one of the MacBook Airs in terms of relatively inexpensive, very, very fast, incredibly good on updates. Like I've had no issues. I said I hate how much I like it. I like just how smooth it works. Hardware wise, it's wonderful. Now I know there is a Linux distro that is working on building out for the MacBook Air. That's still pretty rough experience compared to actually running the Apple software. And for the Apple software, because many of the tools, I use Slack on my Apple. I also use Signal on my Apple. I use LogSeq on my Apple. Those work perfectly fine in the Mac environment. SyncThing also works perfectly fine on my MacBook Air, all running on ARM. So I have this, essentially whenever I'm traveling, I have this laptop that I can get like 10 hours easily of use with a completely fanless laptop. So it's silent, fanless, has decent speakers, watch video. It's become my go-to lightweight, and I can't find an equivalent one. That's where the challenge is. Like I couldn't tell you what to buy in the Lenovo lineup, or even as much as I think System 76 makes some good products, there's not a System 76 equivalent that's going to get the same battery life and lightweight ease of use with a beautiful screen. And by the way, MacBook Air, not insanely priced. I just picked up, my wife has wandered over to the Apple ecosystem, and same thing. She went with a MacBook Air because it just works so well for her. And I couldn't argue. I can't talk her out of it because she uses one for work. And when she used it, she's like, this is the best laptop. I'm like, I can't. Yeah. And she knows I have one. So it is a little bit challenging. Now, all that being said, it still comes down to, what are you going to be doing in your home lab? What are you going to be training on? What are those applications that you need? If you're trying to work in the enterprise space, and the enterprise space, unless you're an app developer for web-facing applications, you're going to go, yeah, I probably have to have some Windows servers. Matter of fact, having your own domain and everything set up at home, getting some of the Microsoft licenses so you can have all that set up and licensed is probably still a good thing. There's, as much as the Linux world that I live in is a wonderful place to me, I do realize the real world I live in is over at CNWR, and that's what pays the bills of us managing lots of Windows machines and Windows domains. And the experience that our technicians have are very firsthand. We have this in our labs. It's something you should probably have in your lab and have it domain joined. I talk to a lot of people that they try to solve the problem of, they've built a domain, they've built it all at their home, and all of their family logs into it, and they've got it all set up really nice. And it's a simulated, if you will, work environment in terms of it's similar to what you may run into the business world. And they try to emulate that with Linux, and they find it a lot more difficult. And yeah, it is. It's not really the same experience in tying Linux to it. And I see people talking about things like GPO and things like that. So I do recommend you spend time with it. If you look in the ecosystems that you will probably have to participate in. Now, we are a little bit unique being an IT services company at, my company CNWR, that we let our staff run Linux. That is something that is an option for them, provided they're proficient in it and it doesn't cause problems, if you will, for them getting their job done, because most of the apps that we use do have support. Even some of our remote control apps do have support for Linux. So some of our commercial tooling will work perfectly fine on there. So you can get away with that. Some of the other staff actually has some Apple and MacBooks, and that's even, as I noted, that's how I connect to my CNWR, is with my Apple. It works well. I can do it on my desktop with Linux, but both. So kind of my overall, like, I'm not telling people not to use Windows. If I don't think everyone should just switch and deal with the pain, and the pain is a learning experience, there's some really valid reasons you may want to run one of these other operating systems. It's just one of those things I want to throw out there to take in consideration. It's one of the reasons when people say I'm not a purist because I run a Windows computer that does all the media ingestion, because it's just easier to set up and control. Yeah, you're not wrong. Matter of fact, when it comes to things like full image backups, I use Synology. Synology does a terrible job doing full image Linux backups. That's why I don't do videos on it. I tested it, and the only thing I can say is, yeah, not great. Don't recommend it. But Synology for Windows full image backups, beautiful. Use it. It's how I make sure that every boot that my Windows, and I have a couple Windows systems like in VirtualBox, I just have them backing up to the Synology. And if ever I have to reload them or re-image them because of a hardware failure, no worries. I just re-image them through the Synology. I've talked about this in videos, and it just works really, really well. So, there's definitely some solid things there. Now, rolling back a little bit through the comments, I will address a couple things because I've seen people worried about LogSeq, and I'm probably going to do a video on LogSeq. The problems where people lose data are mostly the people's problems. If you really start querying people as to how they lost the data, they probably and frequently have goofed up how they're synchronizing things. And that is where some of the problems lie. That's a big challenge with LogSeq. And someone said, what about Obsidian? Obsidian is not open source, so I chose not to use it. I try to lean towards open source applications whenever I can. One of the reasons I landed on LogSeq. That being said, I have goofed things up in LogSeq, but I also have backups of everything, and I have backups of my backups. So I have revisions of things so I can ungoof the things I goof. And that's an important thing that I think not everyone thinks about. For example, I'm using SyncThing for LogSeq, and this is where the challenge. LogSeq isn't natively out of the box synchronizing with all the desktops I logged into. Therefore, including my phone, so desktops or phone OS. Therefore, I have to manage it with SyncThing. If you don't know how SyncThing works, or you mismanage it, or you're someone like me who's been using SyncThing for years, but you for some reason pointed it at the wrong place and then told it to sync and then broke things, yeah, you can make mistakes. There's definitely going to be those challenges because you're tasked with doing it yourself. So I wouldn't worry about LogSeq the app has never lost data. Tom has never actually lost data. Tom has misplaced some data and restored from backup. So the data was never lost. The data was misplaced and then replaced exactly where it should be. So that's probably a big thing to take into consideration if you're going to use LogSeq. I think LogSeq is a really solid tool. I probably will do a tutorial on it pretty soon, but my tutorial is going to be short because there's some people who took the time to do really good in-depth videos. So I'll do my version of how I'm using LogSeq, but I'll also be linking to all the other resources that I found useful along the way that kind of brought me to using LogSeq. It's not, I just don't want to make an 2-hour video on doing this, but I'll leave people with other people who have made hour-long and tutorial videos that are just really good in detail, because it also goes beyond some of my uses. I may not use it as in-depth as you want to use it for. I have a kind of basic usage, but my basic usage is good enough for me. SE people is LOGSEQ, and I'm glad in case anyone doesn't see how it's spelled. Yeah, the LogSeq is easy enough to find. I believe it's at logseq.org. I don't know if it's really worthy. We talked about it's logseq.com, not org. I thought it was an org. So logseq.com, I'll throw that in the comments. LOGSEQ.com. All right. I see people talking about a few other things. I'll make sure I get to all the comments here because that's all I really have on the desktop OS. Just kind of some, thoughts on all of it there. I will admit though, and how much longer? There's always workarounds and hacks for it, essentially being able to create local accounts. That's been a real annoyance when I'm setting up Windows, is having to log into my online accounts just to get Windows set up. I'm like, no, this doesn't seem like the right way to do it. Yeah. Oh, I will say this. I see someone mentioned homebrew for Mac. Yes. Brew is one of those things that I was hesitant, but once I started really learning about it, it really extends, and you can use it in Linux as well, but it really extends the ease of use of setting up certain applications on your Mac device. So if you're in that Mac world, and kind of like I am, Brew makes a few things just easy to install. There's also some there's a tool inside of Brew, or maybe it's inside the Apple Store. There's like some tooling around it to keep things more up to date. I think it's like I said, I hate how much I like the Mac ecosystem. I fought it forever. We had to buy an Apple for a project at work so we could load some of our tooling on there and test it. We specifically needed one with the M1 chip. So I have the original MacBook Air, and I'm blown away. The original M1, not the M2 or M3. My wife has the new M3 one because, if you're going to buy new, you may as well buy one of those, or you can buy them refurbished right from Apple for a pretty big discount. That being said, I have the original one, and the battery still works beautifully. The thing just works, and I can't figure out. I don't know. I should say I can't figure it out. I just know that the market hasn't caught up with it. Apple's really took the time, and it shows, to make things work really well on the M1 series chips. I can live stream and have live stream from my little MacBook Air. My really fast, I think it was an i7 Dell laptop that I had before. It would definitely ramp the fans up every time I did a live stream. Kind of was annoying because you could actually get the fans to a point where you might hear them on the live stream. The MacBook Air doesn't even overheat running a live stream. I'm just like, the efficiency is pretty wild on there. So, let's see. Any other questions we have here? Yeah, stay away from MS online accounts. I agree. I also see people talking about NixOS, and I think NixOS is pretty interesting. I don't know what brought it up to, kind of, maybe it's because a few YouTubers did videos on it. It's become pretty popular, and it's essentially, I'm going to describe it in a broad stroke here because I've not used it, so I can't speak outside of watching a short video explaining it. It's essentially a way that you can define your parameters and what goes into that system. It kind of has if I understood it correctly, kind of a monolithic, like, we're going to define the packages, we're going to define the status of the system in this config file, essentially. And I think that's kind of a neat way to do things. So you can just address or adjust that config file as needed, and you get a very predictable install. So you can just use that config file to rebuild it. Jay does this eventually. Essentially, he's doing all this through Ansible. He has a series of Ansible playbooks that his systems query, seeing if there's any changes. So when he wants to add a package to a Linux distro, he adds it to his Ansible playbook, and then it automatically, all of his systems are always querying it. You can do that type of desired state config, as I see someone posted in the comments. You can absolutely do that with NixOS. That's kind of a really cool concept. I actually really like it. The things that have stopped me from doing it is, one, Pop! OS works wonderfully with all the tools I use. I'm very efficient in it. And my understanding, because I use outside tools that are not part of your standard Linux ecosystem, DaVinci Resolve being one of those examples, that won't work. And so it may work for me using on a laptop that I have running Linux, but I have some Linux laptops. They're stacking up. They're sitting around because the MacBook Air works so well. I just SSH into my jump box to get to all my Linux things that I haven't really used my Linux laptops anymore. I turn them on to update them, but I don't use them near as much as I used to. I just SSH jump box, and then from jump box, I have access to any Linux things. And the jump box is also running. It's a basic Debian install with just my SSH keys on it, because I don't even have my SSH keys on my Apple. That way, the Apple is a device. It's so lightweight if someone took it, and I know it's encrypted, but just in case someone were to try to extract the keys, and I do keep passwords on my keys. So even the passwords, there's a key on my Mac OS that is allowed to access the jump box, but there's a password on that key. There's also a password on the key of the jump box. So someone would have to figure out, you know, unlocking the Mac, figuring out the password that I use to unlock the key, and then SSHing a jump box, which also has passwords on the key. So I've tried to create these extra boundaries, if you will, for those things. So kind of, yeah, I don't know. I can talk more about it. Maybe I'll talk more about this on my live stream tomorrow when I do Vlog Thursday, some of those details about that. What else do we have here? I'm on the hunt for a Mac OS experience on Linux. I've been using Elementary OS, which has a nice feel to it. Yeah, there's definitely, if you think a lot about it, Chris Titus did a good video on talking about how he manages to use things mostly without a Linux desktop. And there's definitely ways you can do that. He went down the rabbit hole of different levels of customization. I don't think a lot about the desktop OS. I just have Windows, as long as the Windows can be dragged around, and I love virtual desktops. And, because you can do that on like the Mac as well, I'm happy. That's kind of my happy spot, is good virtual desktop support, because I'll do things like full screen this application that I'm running, and that works really well. So I just switch to the virtual desktop that's running, for example, like DaVinci Resolve, and I'm like, oh, I need to add this element, or I need to look something up, or I need to pull a graphic in. I can switch to my normal working virtual desktop where I'm searching things with browsers. So there's kind of an easy way for me to handle that in both Linux and Mac. I think you can do that when Windows has some pretty interesting stuff that they can do, but this is where I am showing my Windows lack of knowledge, where I can look up things. I'm usually fixing a service or loading an application. I'm certainly not diving into any of the newer features that they've added since Windows. Well, let's say since Windows 7. That's when the last time I was a power user of Windows was Windows 7. And then we'll just say a few things have changed. My hair's become a lot grayer since the last time I used, Windows as my daily go-to interact with it as an environment for a long time. Yeah, I see someone. Windows does has virtual desktop. Yeah. Uh, which virtualization software do I use on Apple? None. I don't really feel the need to. I always have enough virtual machines running elsewhere. I use XCP-ng for a lot of my virtualization, but I've been playing with Proxmox a little bit more because I've been testing it for on these mini PCs. But I don't really have a need to actually run any of the virtualization on my Apple, especially because it's the M1. The M3 is obviously a lot faster. If I were to use a MacBook Pro, I know there would be plenty of power to run things, but because I'm just using a MacBook Air, I don't think of it as a tool to do that. Matter of fact, if I had to reload my Apple, it would be very minor, just logging into things on Chrome again and it'd be back up and running. Throw a couple applications on and away you go. Oh, let's see. Oh yeah, I see people in Microsoft's definitely disconnected on this. The Microsoft Copilot things. I think you can mostly blame a bunch of disconnected executives, not a nefarious plan. Matter of fact, people who live in a bubble of AI and they go to all these hype meetings. I just think that's what we can call them at Microsoft. The management meetings are probably more like hype meetings of, we spent a lot of money on OpenAI, and the whole, or not open, the Chat GPT, which is really Microsoft GPT because they're so invested in it. We need a return on our investment. How are we going to do it? I don't know. Just slap AI on everything we can. What are we going to do for naming? Well, we're going to make it really confusing because Microsoft has a small number of names they pull from a hat to start naming products. And occasionally they rename them because before you get used to these names, let's change things again. So yeah, definitely, definitely a lot of fun. What do I think of Chasm? I might do a video on it. I use Chasm. I think it's great. KASM, definitely a pretty neat tool for having disposable instances of things. I've been using that for probably about a year. I got no complaints with it at all. So, but I get the complaints people have towards Microsoft because they definitely, like I said in the beginning, I don't know that it's necessarily that they're after your privacy or they have some nefarious reasons. It's more less nefarious and more obvious reasons. They're trying to make money by locking you into their ecosystem and figuring out how to sell you services, how to sell you AI. I don't think there's any non-public way that they're doing things. Everything's very transparent. They're doing this out of greed. Same reason they raise prices for things, not because they wanted to add more features, but because they realize they have product lock-in, and product lock-in for things like Office 365, where people have deep integrations into it. Hey, they're going to just turn the knob up a little, because if you need to make more money and you've already saturated the market as the go-to product, then you have an easy way to make more money. You just, if you can't get more customers, you raise prices. That's kind of the solution I go. So uh, you can't tell everyone that it's secure when you fall victim to security exploits. Yeah, Microsoft is definitely trying to leverage, if we will say, a trust level that they have not earned at all. So that's definitely uh, a challenge for Microsoft. They're trying to pretend they're secure. They talk about security, then they don't do something completely different. So it's definitely really challenging there. All right, before I wander off topic on this, thanks everyone for joining. Great episode here. It was just good interaction with everyone here. Like I said, I'm not hard on any one of these. Whatever one works for you is ultimately there. And because this question will undoubtedly come up in the comments, I will recommend that you use, if you're a home user, the Microsoft Defender works perfectly fine. It's a solid tool to use in terms of Microsoft security. So go ahead and stay with that if you're looking for an AV that comes up from time to time. That's all I use on any of my non-business endpoints for AV on there. So hopefully that clears that up. But maybe not. There'll always be more comments in the future. But thanks everyone for joining, and I'll see you on the next episode.